So you're sitting there, you get an email, and you're like, oh, someone's offering me to do a book. And you're like, cool, that's great. And then you turn it down because that's typically what you do when somebody offers for you to write a book. So I started this little video series called Let's Learn ES6. If you head over to letslearnes6.com, you can sign up for a little news list. And if you go to YouTube and search Let's Learn ES6, you can find all these videos. Basically, there's little chunks of knowledge. So like it'll be one on spread and rest operators or arrow functions and stuff like that. Cool. So I don't know about you, but I heard React was good. Yeah. So now, how many people have been on Twitter in the last several weeks, I guess, and there's like all of these like joke O'Reilly book covers? This was pre-joke O'Reilly book covers. This was, I believe, Wes Boss made this. JavaScript for Millennials, I heard React was good. It's by Macklemore. And this is sort of the sentiment, right? There's so many JavaScript this and that, and all those millennials. I think I'm in the millennial bracket. I'm 31. Does that make me millennial bracket? I have no idea. Anyways, so everyone's trying to use React. We've already heard a couple talks ago. I think it was Brendan was talking about his company stack is Lodash, React, and Redux. So today we're going to talk about sort of what it is if you've never really heard about it, why it's here, what it's good for, maybe some of the shortcomings. And when I'm talking about it, I'm thinking about how we use it at work and what our students are doing. So at HackerYou, we use React internally on a lot of our applications. We have a new note system that we created that I'll show you a little bit of that's built in React. And one thing I need to think about when we're talking about React is how are the alumni or even our current bootcamp students using this. If you haven't heard of HackerYou, we're like a full-time bootcamp. It's 9 weeks. You kind of go in, you learn HTML, CSS. We go all the way to WordPress. We talk about JavaScript, Git, GitHub, stuff like that. So our students are kind of running into this stuff pretty quickly, pretty fast, and how can these new learners learn something like this quickly? React is basically the new AngularJS in terms of job postings. How many of you have noticed this? You go on LinkedIn or you go wherever, you used to always be like, a little bit about Backbone and jQuery, and you're like, okay, cool. It's like Angular expert, and you're like, okay, I think I got that. Now it's like React Redux and like all this stuff, and you're like, ooh, I don't know if I know all that stuff. This is something you have to think about when kind of your core product is helping people kind of shift their careers and get into these jobs. Students are starting, I think the last boot camp, some students just got jobs like right away. Their core things that they're going to be working on is our Angular applications and React applications. And this is informing how we teach. So obviously we teach students about JavaScript. We teach them how to kind of think programmatically and kind of be pragmatic programmers. It's a book I've been reading. I don't know if you've heard of that one. But when students have to start exploring these libraries so early on, these frameworks, we have to start changing how we teach. So before we get into that, why don't we talk about why we have React? We have so many libraries and so many frameworks. Ember. How many people are using Ember? No? Angular? How many people are using Backbone? Vue.js? Mithril? Tesla? I thought I made that one up, but I Googled it and it's a thing. And I was thinking about this the other day, and I'm like, oh, like I want to make a thing. Like I need to have like the thing I want. And I kept Googling, I'll make this thing, and I Google the name, I'm like, not this thing. Keep Googling this, I'm like, everyone's taking the good names, so I'm not going to tell you any of my good names. They're going to be mine. We have so many frameworks that follow this MVC, MV star, MVVM, MVW, that's model view, whatever, pattern. If you actually go, I think the original Angular website, or there's a quote from one of the guys who started Angular, he's like, yeah, it's just like an MVVW. None of these frameworks actually follow this MVC pattern. How many people have used Ruby on Rails before? So that's kind of like pretty close to like the model view controller pattern. And I don't even think long ago, there used to be a lot of this. Like MVC pattern came out of Smalltalk 80, I believe. And that's sort of the last, maybe the last time, first and last time that it was like really strictly followed. Typically we have this MV star idea where we have models or our data and our views. And some are super opinionated. Some of these frameworks are super opinionated. Ember is a really, really opinionated framework. If you've ever worked with it, it is great. It's a great, great framework. It's very large. It has a lot of opinions. So if you want to try to do something that doesn't actually happen in Ember, like, it's really hard to make that happen. Some are not super opinionated. If you've ever used Backbone, there's a lot of freedom there, and that's really quite nice. And this is sort of where React falls. So React is really just a view layer. It's really just sort of the visual representation of some sort of data. And in this case, there is no model. There's no M in React. Sort of, you have to figure that out. So realistically, React is just a whole bunch of components. You have app components and user components and stuff like that. So instead of being sort of the entire framework, if you look at a framework like Ember, everything in Ember is sort of built up, it's ready to go. But with React, you're sort of having to pick and choose. It's like Lego blocks. You have to kind of like pick the stack that you want. You're going to use React, obviously, for the visual component. How are you going to get your data? How are you going to do this? How are you going to do that? And it gives you a lot of freedom to build as you want. Since it's just the view, in React we have components, and components sort of reign supreme, in my mind, I think. So, components allow you to look at your app in a more modular, dry, and reusable manner. Large templates, maybe if you built them pre-Ember components, can be broken down into simple, reusable, and composable components. So I was saying at HackerYou, we use it for internal applications. So we recently rebuilt sort of how we handle our notes. We built a system called Chalk. Remember I told you like naming things was hard? Chalk was a thing. We're like, great name, cool. And then somehow we get an email, I guess because they know we're like an educational software. And this was not like a cease and desist email, but they're like, hey, have you tried our software? It's called Chalk. It was for notes and stuff like that. So got to come up with a new name probably at some point. But if you look at this, this is what we call like our classroom view, and this is broken up into many multiple components. We have all of our sections, HTML and CSS. Each one of those sections has a lesson component. On the sidebar, we have the members component and sort of the course topics component. And we could reuse these all over the place, and in fact, we do reuse these quite a bit. When we were thinking about rebuilding our notes, we used just kind of a flat file, like a Jekyll. Has anybody used Jekyll here before? Or a GH Pages style thing? That's how we used to do the notes. And if you wanted to update something, you literally had to pull it all down, make your change, push it, and redeploy it. Now we've made a system that's more modular. So when we were thinking about that, two things we needed to think about was making it super modular, super easy, and interactive. So to create really nice UI for people who we want to update the notes or want to interact with it. We also wanted to make it easy for us to update it ourselves. And this gave us a great opportunity to really dive into React. So as a teacher, that's my full-time job, which is really interesting. Even my mom doesn't know that it's like a full-time thing. She's like, you still teaching? I'm like, yeah, that's the thing I do full-time. I think she's still a little confused, but I'll get her there. We don't get to work on client-facing projects all the time. So we have to decide sort of ourselves when we're picking new technologies, how do we kind of make sure that we're staying ahead of our students and keeping in line with the industry? So we picked React as sort of our go-to for this. We could have easily picked Angular or Ember or Vue or whatever we wanted, but React made a lot of sense. And if you're interested, the back stack is Node, Mongo, and Express. I actually didn't do a lot of the front end here. The person I work with, Kristen, actually did most of this, so I can't really... that star, I did the star, so it works okay. It's okay. It doesn't work all the time. The great thing that you kind of realize when you start working with React is that everything can be reusable, or you should make sure that everything could be reusable. So in React, it's all about components. So if you take a look at this avatar component, ultimately, you can see down just at the bottom there, there's a return, and it returns just an image. But there's so much more that goes on inside of here. If you've ever worked with Gravatar, it's really great because it's really easy to grab images, but you have to hash the email with MD5. You can put a optional size and stuff like that. So it takes a little bit more getting around it. So with React, we can create a nice little avatar component, something like this, and just use it like this. Say you're spitting out a list of all of the users. So this is sort of from another application we have where we have a lounge, we have some subscriptions, and internally we want to see like who's got what and whatever. So we can use this avatar image over and over again. We can reuse it here if we're spitting out a table, or if we have like an actual lounge member's page or like an admin page, we can reuse this and passing in different props. So you see the attributes email and size. Those are what we call props. And it's how we can get data into our components. There are other ways that I'll explain in a second, but that's one great way to do it. So props allow you to create these nice composable components that allow us to reuse them kind of wherever we want. We could make props optional, so sort of inside the logic of your component, if we left out size, if we go back here, if we left out size, it would just become 200 as opposed to 50. So maybe by default on a user's page, like an actual alumni logs in and they see the image, that's the 200 image. But in a table, maybe we want to set it to 50, or maybe we want even a larger image. With props and this idea of reusable components, we can just sort of create these beautiful, easy-to-use things. The great thing about this idea of components, if we're just thinking about the React in this view layer, is that this isn't the only library that's doing that. Polymer, which was mentioned a little bit earlier, is sort of an implementation of polyfill in the web components spec. So components are going to be coming sort of natively to the browser at some point, but they're not happening fast enough. And I think the great thing about JavaScript is that there's a lot of really smart people out there, and if something is proposed and people are like, I really like that, and it's not happening fast enough, people are just going to implement it themselves. So Polymer is out there. That's from Google. Ember has their own components. And this is sort of making web development a lot easier when we just work in these small little components, as opposed to if you're working in something with like a big template file, like a handlebars file or something along those lines. Nice reusable components is real nice. That's weird. Lifestyles. I always say lifestyles, but it's life cycles. Each component has a life cycle. So I'm just going to talk real briefly about this, but if we have these reusable things, we want to be able to control them a little bit. And these life cycles allow us to control our components. These life cycle hooks will run at certain points of execution. So basically, when you're working with React or any sort of JavaScript framework, you're going to want to get data at some point. Putting data on the page is like the #1 thing you're going to want to do. And within each component, there are lifecycle hooks like component did mount. So when the component is rendered onto the page, so this hook will only run once. This is where you could load your data. So do you need to make an AJAX request to your API? Or do you need to alter some props that came into it? If you need to do something like that, you can do it inside of this component lifecycle hook. If maybe your component hasn't finished all of its things by the time it's about to leave the page, you can use a hook called component will unmount. This will run before the component is removed and allows you to clean some stuff up. If you're used to Backbone, you kind of have to clean up after yourself. This lifecycle hook allows you to do that. I remember building a lot of stuff with Angular, and there's just like a lot of magic that happens there. And I loved working in Backbone because it sort of is a little bit manual. It's a little bit kind of like tedious at times, but you kind of understand how everything is happening. And that's what I'm starting to really like about React, because with these different life cycles, I nailed that one. I didn't say lifestyles, even though in my head I was about to. With these different life cycles, you can kind of like fine grain, work out what you want your components to do. I think one of the great things about components is it makes testing really easy. We should all be testing, or we should be thinking about testing, writing unit tests and stuff like that. But since our components live sort of self-contained, it allows us to test them a lot easier. So consider something like this. You have avatar.js. We're using modules here, letslearnes6.com. Export default, we'll just export our React component, and then we can use import to bring it in. So we could bring that into a file like avatar test, and we could then just test that individual component, as opposed to having to bring in maybe larger templates or larger functions that have it kind of embedded inside of it. If you don't need anything fancy, if you don't actually need to use those lifecycle hooks, you can now create these stateless components, which are really just functions that return our markup or our template, this JSX that we'll talk about in a second. And the great thing about this is not actually React at this point. This is sort of library agnostic, because if you look at it, what is the React portion here? You might think this JSX or this HTML on your page, but there's lots of implementations of this virtual DOM, this HTML in your JavaScript. So this whole component here is actually sort of React agnostic. So you don't even have to have React running to get this to work. You'd have to have a couple other libraries working, so you could kind of do your own thing if you wanted. So in general, components are pretty loosely coupled. They're fairly self-contained, and typically most of the coupling comes from the data that's either coming into it via props or some sort of maybe state change that you need to do. How many people, when they saw JSX for the first time, they were like, no, I don't like that? So the whole idea of JSX, I'll just go back to this slide real quick, is that it's this H3 here. It's putting HTML directly into our JavaScript. And it's not even putting quotes around it. It's not like it's a string. We're not concatenating it. We're not building it up. It's just right in there. And people were like really upset about this. I guess upset. I don't know if you've ever met like a developer, especially JavaScript developers, very opinionated, have a lot of feelings about things. I'll be honest, like when I first saw it, I think I was probably like bandwagoning, and I was like, what is this? I don't like this. I really like it now. HTML in our JavaScript seems a little bit weird at first, but it creates a more intuitive template. And when we're kind of building all these components by themselves and we're exporting them and importing them, when we can put that template and all of our logic together, I think that's really good. This was touched on a little bit earlier in terms of trying to get designers and developers kind of working together, but when you can get a designer to start to go into your React components and start adding more markup or changing classes and changing these sort of things that change the look and feel, where maybe you need to focus more as the front-end developer on sort of more functionality, JSX is really nice because it allows designers, and I designers in quotes here because I think anybody could do this, right? And I don't think it should be designers is it's just the designers, they're going to put this in here. That's really smart. Like it's a great way to work. And it allows us to attach our events right into our DOM elements. It seems counterintuitive at first because we used to learn long ago, back early jQuery days, that we need to decouple our events from the DOM. We used to write our on-click listeners right into our HTML, our body on-loads right on our body HTML, and then we got into jQuery, and we're like, ooh, or even attach event listener, or add event listener, sorry. But we get into jQuery, and it's like $.on-click, and you're like, yes, this looks so much better, and you put that all together, and it works so well. But now, when we create declarative events in the DOM or in our templates, our JSX, everything can exist in one file, and it's easier to sort of reason about because you can track things down really quickly. And it gives you the ability to change things really fast, which is really, really, really nice. It looks something like this. You have a user component, and you have a delete method. Every React component has a render, so that's where you render out your template. And then you have a button inside of I think that C actually should be capital on click, but you have a button in your component that says, when you click this, call the delete method, and then it would delete the user and do any API calls to actually call a server and stuff like that. It makes it really easy to track down, as opposed to having some really, really long app.js, and then you have a user.hbs, and whatever else, and you have to find in app.js the delete stuff, in the user.hbs, so handlebars template, the user template, and start kind of messing around. It's all right there. It's all really nice and easy to use. And because our structure, our data is becoming more and more dynamic, time tying these events here just makes sense. Cool. So those are some good things that I really like. But there are a lack of features in React because it is just the view for your application. So it's sort of the view block, and now you have to decide what to do. This can be a bit intimidating, and people kind of tend to dislike this. React provides us great building blocks, or really block, but it doesn't give us all of the pieces. It's like if you bought a big Lego set, you spent like $100 and something on like the new Star Wars Millennium Falcon. Those things are so expensive now. I remember when I was a kid, my mom would get those for Christmas and be like, cool. And then I'm like, that was a lot of money. You didn't have to spend that, Mom. But you get that box, you spent so much money, and then you get like this one, like the I don't know, the cockpit, and you're like, this doesn't do it for me. Like, how do I get the rest going on? This is on purpose because they don't want to be sort of this super opinionated thing. So you have to go out to the Lego store and like go to all the different bins and pick out your pieces. And I think that can be a good thing. However, this does make it so that there's no clear path of how you do things. There's no library name way of doing things. Little ES6 joke there, template literals. Less than ES6.com. So how do you start a project? Since React is just one layer of your application, there's no like bootstrap, there's no boilerplate, there's no like, where do we get going? Webpack is really popular, but can be like really difficult to set up if you're not really into that right away. Once you get it configured, great. Maybe Gulp and like Browserify, so Gulp to build all your stuff, but Browserify to pull in some modules. NPM scripts, I hear that's really cool. If we're going back to the JavaScript millennials, Gulp was cool. Now we're back to NPM scripts. So Babelify, so maybe we do want to write all of our stuff in this nice, great ES6 syntax, and we want the benefits of Browserify. Let's use Babelify, but that's confusing because do you still need Browserify? Yeah, probably, I don't know. Grunt, does anybody remember Grunt? They have a version 1 now, so that's really cool. I love Grunt. Their logo is much better than Gulp, too, so that makes sense. I know I've been talking about Ember a lot because I just feel like this is sort of like the exact opposite end of the spectrum when it comes to opinionated versus not opinionated. With Ember, there's like a real Ember way of doing things. Ember has the Ember CLI, which is a really, really great tool. Basically, you probably wouldn't start an Ember app today without the Ember CLI. So if you wanted to create a new application, you say Ember new app. Done. It creates all the folder structure for you. It creates any build scripts that you need to build. Tests, it'll mock up some tests for the sort of scaffolded project that you already create or you get when you run this command. Need to create a component, Ember generate component user. This will create in a components folder a new user.js file. It'll pre-fill a lot of the JS for you. It'll create in a test folder a test for this user component. And it'll also pre-fill some of that stuff for you because there's some stuff that you already need to do when you're testing, which is weird, which is why testing is kind of tedious sometimes. It's like one of your tests is like, does this thing exist? So maybe this would make that test for you because it's like, I just made this for you, so it probably exists, right? There's no tooling like this for React just yet. There are some projects. There's like React CLI or Ratchet CLI, or you could build your own. And this is actually something I've considered for us at HackerYou because I think when we started our first big React project, we kind of sat down and decided what we wanted to do in terms of structure. Excuse me. And we came up with a pretty good plan, so why not build something that kind of just like scaffolds that stuff out for us? We could maybe utilize one of these, but would it know like our gulp file that we like to use, what modules we like to use? Do we put Babelify in there? Do we include, the Babel specific presets and this and that? When you work with Ember CLI, it's just kind of there for you. It's really nice and easy and good to go. But when it comes to React, it's a little difficult. You have to like start thinking about what's there. There is no set structure for a React app. And I think this is one of the places where people get a little frustrated. It's like the hello world example for these things could be a whole lot of code, or it could be very little code. But since there's no like set way to do it, it's like you just kind of have to figure it out. So the next thing is data. So again, we're building with JavaScript. Probably the first thing we want to do after getting ourselves set up is actually make some API calls, AJAX calls, and get some data on the page, render this and that, and do whatever. When you work with most frameworks or libraries, they have a preferred way of doing this. So Ember has Ember data that kind of maps to the JSON API spec backend. Angular has the HTTP module, which just allows you to make your HTTP requests. Backbone has like Backbone model and Backbone collection where you can set up URLs and fetch the data however you want. But I guess React has what? It's just a little layer, so now you're up to thinking about what you need to do. $.ajax, so do you want to just be real simple, find a custom build of jQuery where it's just literally $.ajax? Sometimes I find like the only reason I use jQuery is $.ajax because it's so easy. Fetch, they finally made that happen. Thanks, Eva. But Fetch is a great new browser API. I think people get confused with Fetch being like an ES6 thing. It's just a new API in the browser. But Fetch is a new way to get data. It's really quite nice. You go Fetch, you give it a URL, you get some parameters, and then it sends it back to you. So you could use Fetch if you wanted. Or I guess you could like roll your own as well. There was also some talk earlier today about using stuff like super agent. There's so many different ways to get AJAX, or make AJAX requests, excuse me, that you sort of have to now decide what you're going to want to do with this. It's up to you, and I think that can be a little bit daunting, but it also can be kind of freeing because early on working with Ember data, for example, really frustrating, really quite difficult. It took a while for them to iron things out. So if you had the ability to just choose what you wanted, then you'd have more productive time building your application. And I think the final thing we're going to talk about is, in terms of the structure, is the application flow. So how do you handle that data once it's in your application? So again, React is not an MVC framework. It doesn't have that traditional model view controller setup. It's just the V portion. And even then, like, I wouldn't even think of it so much as that V. It's just sort of these minimal components that we're building up together. So how do we manage our application's data? So Facebook has a way to do this. They introduced this thing called Flux. And this is their proposed application architecture, but it's not an actual implementation. And this confused me for so long when it first came out, because I would go to the Flux website, I'm like, great, I'm going to download the Flux library, this is going to be awesome. Then you start reading the docs, and you're like, where's the CDN link? How do I paste it onto the page? It's not there, because you have to sort of come up with it. And this fixed a very specific problem at Facebook. Famously, they had that bug where if you had a notification, there was a little red dot, like 1 notification, 2, whatever. But when you went to go click on it, there was nothing there. They had this problem of state was being changed somewhere, data was coming in, and when you went to go view your notification, it wasn't there, but somehow something else didn't get notified about that, and it just kept showing you this other thing. So they created this idea, once they started to move over to React, of Flux. And the pattern looks a little bit like this. So you have these dispatchers that receive these actions. So an action could be something like delete user. Those actions go through a dispatcher, and they go through a store. That store will perform the action or whatever, and then that will go to the view, and the new data will be rendered onto the page. And then if the user interacts with that action or that view again, a new action could be fired, and the whole thing loops around. So again, it was not an actual implementation. It was just an idea. And the most common implementation, well, sort of implementation of it is Redux. But the great thing about React is that because it's sort of this you don't have to buy into everything, you don't actually have to use Redux. Redux includes a whole bunch of other things. It has like reducers and all of these things, and you don't actually have to use it. We actually have a situation, so famously, like if you want to use React and Redux, don't just start with Redux. Like get to the point where you actually have to use Redux. And the reason you'd want to use Redux is if you have like some global state that, if one thing changes, multiple other components have to change. Don't just start out trying to use Redux. We got to the point in our, actually 2 apps that we have where this is now an issue where some global state changes, so like a user signs up and I need now like 3 or 4 different components to change. So I could use Redux if I wanted, but because I have the freedom, I'm actually probably going to implement a sort of Flux example, because it actually is going to solve my issue a little bit easier, and I don't have to kind of go through all of the stuff just to use Redux. If you want data as well, there's also Relay and GraphQL and all of these different things that they've just introduced, and I'm not even sure what they do, but these are other ways of getting data. How many people use Node here? No? A couple? How many people have heard of Node School Toronto? Oh, you should go to Node School Toronto, or nodeschool.io/Toronto. I'm part of Node School Toronto, and we have one learner who's really getting into GraphQL, and I actually like going over to help him because I don't know that much about it, but I can kind of like, massage my way through it. Really interesting stuff, but again, these are little bits and pieces. You don't have to use everything. So just to finish up, some of the good parts. I've already talked about some of these, but speed is a really, really nice thing about React. React does this thing, if you've ever used Backbone, if you need to change something in a view, you have to re-render that entire view. If you know anything about web performance, repainting large sections of the page, not so great. React has a way of diffing, so if you've ever used Git and you have like two files, like one old version, one new version, you can see like what changed, and if only one line is changed in your React view, React will just update that one line as opposed to update the entire thing. And this is also really good because this has actually pushed Ember, so Tom Dale and Yehuda Katz, has pushed them to create something called Glimmer, which has increased the speed of Ember. So now we're getting, because React was so fast, basically they said, this is some really good stuff, this is some really great ideas, we're going to make our own thing, put into Ember, and now Ember's really fast, and React's really fast, and everybody wins, I think, there. It forces exploration. So because there's missing parts, you now have to decide what pieces are going to be good for you. Not every solution out there, not every everything in Ember is going to be right for your application. So now it's up to you to decide what do you want to use. And ultimately, I think it's creating better JS devs. So just JavaScript in general. Because it's not a framework-specific way of doing things, it's creating these developers who now have to think about how things work. How does immutability work? How do functions work? How does the this keyword bind? It's like thinking more and more and more about just the core JavaScript skills. It's just JavaScript. If you don't know what the sticker is, come find me after. I have some just JavaScript stickers, and I also have a couple of React stickers if anybody wants them. It's also introducing people to ES6. It's introducing people to functional programming. I was actually talking to one of the mentors at Node School, who is a guy I pretty much look up to, and he was saying that he'd be doing some React stuff at work, and he was surprised at how much it was pushing his skill level because of how much he was using map and reduce, all these like array methods, and how much he took them for granted until he had to do sort of stuff beyond, just like doubling the number all the time. It really introduced this whole new world to him. It introduces people to the idea of immutability. So if you're using Redux, the whole idea is that every time you get new data back, it's not the same data just like the thing removed. It's completely new data just with the thing removed, but it's not the same object. So you can actually like go backwards in time and stuff like that. It's really neat. So I think one thing to think about before we finish off here is that people can get afraid of all the possible possibilities, but it's really important to remember. And Dan Abramoff is a guy who made Redux. He now works on the React team. Sometimes he streams on Twitch, him working on React, which is pretty neat. But basically, if you don't need these things, so if you take Webpack, do you need code splitting, multiple entry points, compile time transforms, multiple input modules? No, then don't use it. You don't need it all, and you should definitely explore React because I think it would be really great. Real quick, I'm just going to shout this out for Wes Boss. If you are thinking about getting React, reactforbeginners.com is a really great little course for that. Thanks.